The western approaches to the English Channel have always proved a challenge to those who go down to the sea in ships. The area is strewn with sunken vessels, casualties of inexact navigation, storms and conflict. Occasionally, the sea allows us to rediscover the wrecks lying in these silent deeps, and by so doing, allows us to unravel history. This is a story of modern maritime history, a small incident perhaps in a theatre of war that encompassed several continents. But for those who took part, it will always remain a vivid, personal and unforgettable action. It's recorded here, lest we forget. When Shelton Bosley last cruised these waters, it was under vastly different circumstances. The world was at war. The Channel Islands were a hunting ground for Allied torpedo boats and their destroyer escorts. It was a time when patrolling at night in dangerous waters was a way of life.
We had some good friends on that boat, the 509. At total that night, I think we lost 16 men. I thank the good Lord that we came through that as well as we did, considering what had happened.
In the summer of 1944, American motor torpedo boat squadrons working out of Cherbourg patrolled the waters of the still-occupied Channel Islands. Their task was to engage an enemy still reeling from the aftershock of the D-Day landings. The Channel Islands lie at a point where a deep Atlantic Ocean climbs a massive natural shelf to create the shallow, choppy seas approaching the southernmost ports of the United Kingdom. Alderney, the most northerly island, lies 70 miles from the nearest English port and about 8 miles from the western coast of the Cherbourg Peninsula in Normandy. Jersey, the largest of the islands, is 16 miles from France at its nearest point and some 36 miles from the city of St. Malo in Brittany. Guernsey lies at the very edge of the western approaches. The Channel Islands were the only land areas in the United Kingdom occupied by German forces during World War II. Heavily fortified as part of Hitler's Fortress Europe, the largest islands, Jersey and Guernsey, provided air bases and rest centers for German troops in Western Europe. The islands were of little strategic value to the Third Reich, but Hitler considered their capture and the virtual imprisonment of their communities for 6 long years a rich source of propaganda. And he regarded their occupation as a festering thorn in the side of the stubborn British. In Alderney, beneath the green waters of a deep, rocky quarry, relics of occupation still exist, exactly as they were dumped by an army in fear of Allied invasion. Ammunition, field kitchens, even buses and cars still lay in these still waters today. Half a century on, there are still many islanders who remember with dread the feeling of being cut off from the rest of the world and being governed by a foreign military power. On the 6th of June 1944, the invasion of Europe began. Prominence was given to land forces. In order to gain that first vital foothold, massive Allied air and sea support was essential. Allied air forces flew 3 British, American and Canadian airborne divisions over the Channel and into battle. Over 5,000 vessels ranging from capital ships to landing craft transported, escorted and landed the 130,000-strong assault force along 50 miles of Normandy coast between the Cotentin Peninsula and the River Orne. Protecting the western seaward end of the assault area during and for some time after the initial landings was the Mason Line, a string of some 20 heavily armed US Navy patrol torpedo boats. The picket line covered 6.5 miles of enemy-held waters, and their main task was to engage German E-boats, the biggest potential threat to the invasion fleet anchored off the landing beaches. The boats also carried enough depth charges to make them a formidable anti-submarine weapon. The PT boats from their position offshore witnessed one of the most historic seaborne invasions of World War II.
We had a front row seat for the invasion because it was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and I believe that HR was just about that time. We pulled out of the way and we laid to and watched the armada of ships that literally covered the whole horizon.
The average time these boats spent on the Mason Line was a week. The PTs were supplied with fuel, water and stores at sea, but made the 40-mile voyage back to their Portland base for damage and mechanical repairs. The PT's primary mission was to attack surface ships and craft, but its speed and versatility made it useful in other areas too. It proved effective in laying mines and smoke screens, made air-sea rescue missions and carried out intelligence and radar operations.
We went on station duty on the invasion coast, watching for mine layers and anything that we could knock down. A lot of Stukas came in at that time. And we stayed on station, 12 of us, right straight out on Utah Beach.
Despite carrying heavy caliber machine guns, torpedoes and depth charges, the boats were vulnerable while under fire. They were literally floating fuel tanks, brimming as they were with gasoline when they put to sea. Any direct hit on the timber hull would cause them to disintegrate or explode. They relied on their 40-knot attack speed, maneuverability and firepower during hit-and-run surface attacks.
We're not used to doing this, but we were doing something like 9 or 10 knots in this very rough sea. And our orders were to stay with these minesweepers, protect them at all costs. And regardless of what happened, we were to protect those ships and make sure nothing got close to them. They thought that we would sustain a considerable high casualty ratio.
The crews were young, somewhat individualistic, resilient and reckless. A combination which, although somewhat unorthodox in the eyes of acceptable naval tradition, made them and their boats an unpredictable and dangerous adversary. The history of these fast boats with a mean sting began back in 1937, when the United States Navy launched a torpedo boat design competition. 3 companies produced acceptable blueprints: Elco, Higgins Industries, and Huckins Yacht Corporation. Thus, the US Navy acquired a new, highly effective weapon for its armory, the patrol torpedo boat. The PT was born. Few would have guessed at the time that the resulting vessels would see action in several theaters of war within just a few years. During World War II, PTs operated in southern, western and northern Pacific areas, the Mediterranean, the Aleutian Islands and the English Channel. Elco, the naval division of the Electric Boat Company at Bayonne, New Jersey, built most of the PTs that saw action in British waters. They also produced the largest of the 3 types of PTs built. They were wooden-hulled, 80 feet long with a 20-foot 8-inch beam. The power pack comprised 3 12-cylinder Packard gasoline engines generating 4,500 horsepower for a design speed of 41 knots. Below decks there was accommodation for 3 officers and 14 men. The vessel's full load displacement was 56 tons. In 1940, the US Navy decided to organize PT boats into squadrons, usually made up of between 12 and 16 boats. These were then commissioned as squadrons, rather than commissioning the hundreds of individual boats that would eventually be built. Typical of military abbreviation, the general title Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron was shortened to ROM, the last 3 letters of the word squadron. A total of 43 ROMs were commissioned, and our story follows the saltwater trail of just one of them, PT Squadron 34. In 1944, events in Europe were reaching a turning point, and plans for some of the newly commissioned PT squadrons were abruptly changed. 23-year-old Russell Schuster, Lieutenant Junior Grade, was assigned to RON 34.
Our squadron was commissioned in January of 1944. Our boats were green when they were delivered from the Elko Boat Company because we were destined for duty in the Pacific. After we had the boats, about 3 months, we were in Miami, Florida on shakedown, and we received orders to return to New York, and our boats were repainted from green to gray, and we were sent to the English Channel.
The boats and crews of RON 34 were loaded aboard tankers and Liberty ships and convoyed across a U-boat haunted Atlantic to arrive at their English Channel base on May 16, 1944. It was the 26th of June before Allied troops entered Cherbourg. Almost a fifth of the town was destroyed by continuous air raids, and the Germans themselves blew up the naval arsenal before they capitulated on the 27th. At the beginning of August, with beachheads secure and the land battle progressing down the Cherbourg Peninsula towards St. Malo, PT Squadrons 34 and 30 of the US 11th Amphibious Forces withdrew from the Normandy landing areas. Some returned to Portsmouth, and 18 boats set up base at the port of Cherbourg. Al Duquette was loader on the 37mm bow gun aboard the 503.
I think everybody called me Duke back then. I was the ship's cook, and when we made these patrols, we didn't do much cooking on the boat. We ate on the base. Didn't have time. We were up all night at battle stations, and you try to get some sleep in the daytime because you might have to go out again tonight.
Despite heavy damage to both town and dockyard facilities, the former E-boat torpedo shop and the enemy's engine repair workshops were usable. A floating dry dock, towed across the channel from England, dealt with all but major hull damage repairs. Lieutenant H.J. Sherritts, USNR, commander of RON 34, commanded the Cherbourg base.
As time progressed, we started to do our patrolling in the Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Sauk, and a few other ones. But mainly we were concentrating on the islands of Jersey and Guernsey.
The Allies apparently decided that it was not important enough to try to bomb those islands to get those Germans to capitulate or anything like that. So the islands remained in German control, and of course there were enemy soldiers in those islands, and they had need to take supplies between the islands, and they also had need to transfer personnel between the islands. So our job, which was assigned to us, was to patrol those islands and try to harass or stop the movement of troops between the islands.
Usually patrols would be made up of 6 boats. We would have a vickering ship, and it would either be the Malloy or the Borum. These were both DEs, and they were sister ships.
It was kind of a routine operation. We left Cherbourg Harbor sometime around 4 o'clock in the afternoon to get on station at the Channel Islands about, I guess it was around 11 o'clock is when we were due to be there, so we'd arrive around 10 or 10:30. And we'd patrol until about 5 o'clock in the morning when daylight started to break.
At 03:45 hours on the morning of August the 9th, after several delays, a German convoy under the command of Captain Lieutenant Armin Zimmermann crept through the rocky small roads of St. Peter Port, Guernsey, bound for the port of St. Helier in Jersey, a voyage of some 25 miles.
We left at about 3 a.m. in the morning from Guernsey, and our destination was Jersey. We had many troops on board our ship, about 60.
Unknown to the German commander, British naval intelligence was already aware of the planned convoy. Supposedly secure German Enigma-coded messages had been intercepted. The convoy consisted of 2 small freighters, the Robert Muller and the Lena. 5 M-class minesweepers and 3 armed trawlers escorted them. Zimmerman commanded from M4626 and ordered M4621 to take the Lena in tow because of her slow speed.
We were on our way from St. Peter's Port to St. Helier. The weather was not as good as it had been at midnight. Fog came down and visibility was very poor.
Part of the convoy's cargo was a 15-centimeter coastal artillery battery, complete with personnel. It was due to be installed on Jersey's east coast at the orders of Naval Commander Channel Islands Admiral Hufmeier. It was his message informing Marine Gruppenkommando in Germany of his intentions that had been intercepted. Aboard each escort was 60 well-armed troops bound for duty in Jersey. The weather was calm, but visibility was poor. A thick summer fog was developing among the islands. At 1700 hours on the evening of the 8th of August, a group of PT boats departed Cherbourg in company with their DE, the destroyer escort USS Malloy. It appeared a routine mission, but for 16 crew members, it was to be their last patrol.
We left Cherbourg Harbor, the 6 boats. We were split into 2 groups once we reached the patrolling grounds, but en route, the 506 boat did develop a mechanical problem and received permission to return to base.
2 of the commanders on patrol that night, seen here on the bridge of the 507, were Lieutenant Harry Christ on the right and Ensign Buell Hemingway. For them, this would be no routine patrol. The boats were armed with 2 Mark 13 torpedoes, 600-pound depth charges, 2 50 caliber guns, 1 40mm stern gun, and a 37mm aircraft cannon on the bow.
We would all clear our guns, test them. My battle station was in the after 50s. These guns each had ammunition 500 rounds per gun, so we were amply supplied. The 50 calibers I thought were an awesome gun for their size and the firepower, and they were my favorite on the boat, even though they were the smallest. And I took care of them, and they were always clean and ready to go. Having patrolled before, we were aware that the long nights became rather cool, and most of us would don heavy clothes, a jumper and a jacket that was issued. In the patrolling area, we then had flak jackets where had recently been issued to us. These were the same type of flak jackets that were used by airmen, and it was one of the ideas of our officers in the squadron to issue them to the men. As it turned out, it probably saved several lives. And these jackets would weigh somewhere close to 30 pounds. And these would go on top of your regular jacket, and then on top of that would go your K-POC life preserver. There was always some controversy. Some of the men hesitated at first to put these jackets on because they weighed close to 30 pounds. And they thought if they were blown overside, that perhaps maybe they would go right to the bottom.
At 10:45 hours, USS Malloy, escorted by her flotilla of PT boats, arrived 8 miles off the west coast of Jersey and commenced patrol. Her speed was 10 knots, and the ship was darkened and in war cruising readiness. Visibility at the time was 3 miles. On board was veteran MTB skipper Lieutenant Commander Peter Scott, son of the Arctic explorer. Scott was liaison officer to the Americans and acted as vectoring controller to the PTs during patrols. By 03:25 hours, the weather had deteriorated and fog had set in from the northwest. Visibility was down to 100 yards.
It was a pretty foggy night. Visibility was not good, but this was excellent for a PT attack because the PT boat attacked best at night in dark. Surprise was the important factor.
Out in the thick fog, flanking the Malloy, their engines growling, the PTs awaited orders from the vector ship. At 0400 hours aboard M4626, the commander, Zimmermann, was desperately trying to hold his command together. At times, visibility was down to 50 yards. There'd been several near collisions and navigation lights were not penetrating the dense fog.
The weather was calm, but visibility was very poor. There was a thick fog, so it was difficult to keep the flotilla together.
Communicating with his ships by megaphone, he ordered the convoy to move closer together and switch on their searchlights. The crews could hardly see the forecastles of their own vessels. The convoy, now 12 miles off the west coast of Jersey, was picked up on Malloy's radar at 0450 hours. The vector ship went to battle stations and sent Tunney Group, the code name for PTs 503, 500 and 507, in with muffled engines to attack.
Because you go in with the mufflers closed and you try to be as quiet as you can. You sneak in. Hopefully you can get in close enough before you're discovered that you can effectively fire the torpedoes.
At 5 miles distance, the PTs picked up the convoy on their own radar. By this time, visibility was down to 25 yards. Aboard the convoy, Zimmermann was receiving continuous reports of engine and propeller noise picked up by the hydrophones.
We could not actually see anything, but we were able to detect some noises through our headphones. And we established that it was the propellers. So we knew the enemy was out there tracking us.
The German equipment was far less sophisticated than Allied radar, and in the dense fog, Zimmermann was completely unaware that his convoy was already under surface torpedo attack. Using their radar to mark the distance, speed and direction of the convoy, the PTs launched torpedoes at a distance of between 1,500 and 2,000 yards.
So we closed the target to something like 2,000 yards.
Skipper gave the orders to fire the torpedo, our starboard torpedo.
Conditions were perfect for a PT attack. The convoy was blinded by fog, the sea was calm, and yet no impacts were recorded.
We did not hear any explosions from those torpedoes, so we had to conclude that we had either missed the target or that the torpedo had run afoul.
The torpedoes aboard the PTs were set to run at a depth of 10 feet, but they were dealing with shallow draft vessels perfectly suited to the waters of the Channel Islands. Death and destruction had either slipped between or perhaps underneath the German hulls.
I wasn't surprised if we did, because we couldn't see anything. We were just firing into the dark at what they told us to fire at. And you know, if we could have seen the ship ahead of us or something, then maybe we could have scored a hit.
There was no need for Tunney Group to make smoke to cover their retreat. The fog was enough to hide their return to the Malloy. At 0545, PT509, commanded by Barracuda Group Leader Lieutenant Harry Christ, set course, accompanied by 508, to intercept the convoy as it turned east around Corbière Point. Malloy once again vectored the boats in. Visibility was now down to 100 yards. The 509, with 508 riding on her starboard bow, crossed ahead of the convoy. Visibility was down to 25 yards as the two PTs turned for an attack run. The 509 fired one fish, but her consort held fire because of a radar fault. The boat circled and came in for a second run. This time, the 508 fired a single torpedo with target bearings and distance given by radio from the 509. No hits were recorded. No hits at almost point-blank range must have been very hard for the PT crews to believe. And it was at this point that Christ decided to make a gunnery attack, running parallel to the convoy.
And about that time, the 509 skipper came on and said, request permission to proceed independently. I want to get in closer before I fire.
Chris took the 509 into attack with all engines roaring and all guns blazing. Aboard 508, the crew heard gunfire distorted by the fog, and over their radio they picked up just a single sentence from 509. We're directly in the middle of them. 508 was unable to give support fire because they knew 509 was directly ahead. The chance of strafing their lead boat was too big a risk. The minesweeper M4626 sighted the attacking PT boat as she burst out of the fog, and at once heavy caliber rounds were smashing through her bridge and midship sections. Her commander, Christian Kramer, ordered hard port rudder, still fearing a torpedo attack.
At that moment, I turned my ship in order to place ourselves in an offensive position, which meant I put my ship on a collision course with the Americans. I took this extreme course of action to prevent the Americans from releasing their torpedoes. These torpedoes would have been aimed at my ship.
Fire from the 509 took out the minesweeper's 8.8 centimeter gun and its crew in the opening moments of the run, but almost immediately she was caught in heavy and accurate crossfire. Seconds later, a shell burst killed the 509's wheelman, Lieutenant John Pavlis, and another demolished the chart house, stunning radarman John Page. With no one at the helm and out of control, the 509 swerved violently and roared at full power into the gun smoke directly towards the rust-stained hull of the enemy ship, which was now desperately trying to turn into the attack. She struck the minesweeper just aft of the bridge on the port side, and the impact was enough to send the heavy vessel rolling over on a beam end.
It was at that moment the Americans rammed us. I'm sure they would have torpedoed us otherwise.
At that same moment aboard PT508 and the Malloy, radar showed the 509 and the minesweeper become a single blip on their screens.
A battle then ensued between us, and the soldiers we were carrying joined in the fight. At first, only shots were fired from both sides. And then men started to throw hand grenades from one side to the other.
Since the Normandy landings, Jersey's massive defensive system was on full alert. Artillery and aerial bombardments could be heard clearly from the island as Allied forces pushed hard down the Cherbourg Peninsula towards St. Malo. The German command was convinced an invasion of the islands was imminent, and a firefight almost beneath the powerful shore defences must have set alarm bells ringing. They were no doubt aware too that a convoy was due in from Guernsey but could do nothing to defend it while the thick fog covered inshore waters. The PT boat lay helpless. Her bows had been smashed off on impact, fire had taken a grip of her timber hull, and the forward thrust of her still screaming engines were pinning her to the side of the minesweeper. It was at this moment, amid a hail of bullets and the roar of the 509's engines at full throttle, that John Page regained consciousness. He had the presence of mind to destroy the radar set before dragging himself towards the bow ahead of the flames. He'd sustained no less than 37 shrapnel and bullet wounds. His right arm and his left leg were both broken. Some of the German crew had boarded the 509. While she was still wedged alongside the minesweeper, in her death throes, she could still carry out her mission. A live torpedo sat in its cradle. There were depth charges on board, and her fuel tank still contained enough gasoline to cause death and destruction if they exploded alongside.
The PT boat began burning, and we knew we had to extinguish the fire, as we were sure that any ammunition on board would cause both ships to blow up.
The German crew fought hard with boathooks and steel bars to break the 509's deadly embrace. Suddenly, the 509's engine stopped, and in the following silence she began drifting free of the sweeper. Those German crewmen still on board scrambled for the safety of their own vessel, and with the typical compassion of seafarers, they took John Page with them.
We pulled an injured American sailor off the PT boat. I then attempted to get back to my own ship. This very nearly failed as my feet became entangled in some ropes from the American boat. Luckily, some of my comrades were able to free me, or I would have been pulled into the water.
Wreathed in the smoke and flames of battle, the 509 drifted down the side of the now silent minesweeper and into the fog. As Page lay on the enemy's deck in a haze of pain, he saw several of his shipmates, including William Orsley, the bow gunner, lying dead across the deck. And he remembered seeing those few who had survived the firefight jump into the sea. Moments later, he recalled a tremendous explosion and a heat blast like an opening furnace door. In the uncertain acoustic atmosphere of the thick fog, the sound of the 509 exploding could easily have been interpreted as a torpedo strike. The explosion was a torpedo, but not a hit. The remaining fish had ignited on the deck of the 509 as she drifted in flames through the fog.
There was a lot of gunfire, and then we could not raise the 509 boat on the radio. We retired to the destroyer that was vectoring us.
The destroyer escort, the radar, picked up an object. Not knowing what the object was, we thought perhaps it could be the disabled 509 sitting there, and we didn't want to leave it there. It was too close to shore.
We sort of organized a plan to try to go out and look for the 509 boat. And so the 507 boat and the 503 boat, which I was on, went out in the direction of the convoy.
In the fog and confusion, M4621, with Alina still in tow, had veered off course, and both had run aground on the Groenvodin Reef. It was here that PT's 503 and 507 found them, as they continued the search for the 509.
I remember hearing the radar man saying, "We're probably 5 miles away." Probably 10 minutes later, I'd hear him say, "We have the target 3 miles away, and 2 miles away, and 1 mile away." And
finally, the last time I heard him come up and say, "Skipper, if you don't stop this boat, you're going to ram whatever's out there in front of us." And no sooner had the words cleared his mouth, the fog lifted, and there sat these two German ships.
Could have been more than half a football field away from us. I could see these guys running on the deck and everything else. We were that close.
And there was a momentary pause before the fire came back.
I never waited to hear the order to fire. It was kind of an instinctive thing. I already had my safety off on the guns, and I just held my fingers down on the triggers.
there was an awful lot of gunfire, and after we turned around, being out the bow of the boat, we couldn't fire anymore. We'd be hitting our own people. So Sully hit the deck, and he was yelling at me to get down. But being so inexperienced and so young, I wanted a better view. I stood up on the ammunition box so I could see better. Until I saw a real large hole in the chart room that wasn't there before. And I said, oh, I was down on the deck, right alongside of him.
I was on the wheel in the cockpit. The shells were coming toward our starboard side, and the shells hit the radar mast, sprayed shrapnel all over the cockpit.
Well, there were only 3 on the entire boat that didn't get any shrapnel. Russ and Sully and I were the other 2. So we were lucky.
We have a 40 millimeter on the stern, And we actually got off about 24 rounds there, and I'm sure that that probably did a lot of damage to the people who were on the deck.
Ron 34 was taking on a war-hardened enemy, and their own lack of battle experience put the outcome of the fight firmly in the balance.
Well, actually, the Germans were very experienced fighters. We were as green as grass. Most of us were civilians 12 months before this action took place.
The two boats accelerated away to port, the 503 trailing dense smoke from her stern. A suspected engine room fire turned out to be a direct hit on the PT's smoke tank. The tank was jettisoned and the 503 continued under full power. Unbeknown to the Germans, they'd actually aided the 503's escape.
The Germans were kind of helpful to us because normally a PT boat will lay a smoke screen when they retire. Well, we had the help of the fog, but the Germans helped us because they shot a hole in our smoke generator in the back. And so there was just clouds of smoke coming out from the back of the boat.
At 08:37 hours, the two boats came alongside the Malloy and began counting the costs of the night action.
Then when we found out from the 3 boat that they had really suffered, 2 of their men were badly wounded, not expected to live. And we could tell when they were removing their bodies and from the turret and from their battle stations, you can almost see that it didn't look very good. And, I mean, just, we know all these men. They're on different boats, but we know them pretty well. And it gives you a funny feeling.
Boys Brum, gunner aboard the 503, was already dead, and all but 3 had suffered wounds. Elmer Albright, mechanic, died later that morning.
So as it turned out, before the night was over then, we lost 16 men total, and not counting the wounded on both the 507 and the 503.
Aboard the 507, Quartermaster Bob Hatmaker was the only crew member injured.
We had one of our crew members was wounded, Bob Hatmaker, after he was attended to by the executive officer. Our main concern went to our dog. We had a Newfoundland dog, and it was down in the day room. And we opened the hatch expecting to find the dog dead. But to our amazement, he crawled under the bunk and was, outside of being scared, he was in good shape.
With all the remaining PTs regrouped, the patrol returned to Cherbourg. On the way, the Malloy requested a Sunderland flying boat from Plymouth to make a search south of Jersey for the 509.
We never did find any part of the 509 boat. It simply disappeared that night. A couple of days later, some of the Air Force planes were surveying the area, and they did find a portion of the 509 boat. It was just the front part of the lower part of the boat.
It was a sad and thoughtful patrol that returned to Cherbourg on that sun-filled summer morning.
We lost 2 good friends that night. 2 of them were killed, and that was bad. And when they're people that you're living with, they're like your brothers, you know, so. We were saddened by that.
The trip back to Cherbourg was pretty solemn. We pretty much knew then that the 509, we figured the worst had happened.
The loss of the 509 boat for our squadron was very traumatic to the men that were in the squadron because it was one of 12 boats that was in the squadron. So I miss those guys.
And things were pretty quiet on the way back. I mean, it was just a feeling. I can't tell you the feeling except when the sun was coming up, on our way back, the sun started to come up. And this is my personal feeling, I just felt, I said, God, it's glad to be alive, just to be alive, you know, after this. And I can't totally explain it.
John Page was given basic first aid along with the German wounded while on board his rescue ship. M4626 entered St Helier Harbour at 09:30 hours on the morning of August the 9th, 6 hours after leaving Guernsey. Despite the convoy's superior firepower, it sustained heavy damage from RON 34 strafing attacks. 4 Germans were killed and 41 wounded. 3 of the convoy's escort vessels were put out of commission for several weeks. Page was transferred to the quay, where attempts were made to question him by 2 Gestapo officers. They gave up on realizing the extent of his wounds. Later, after extensive surgery at St Helier Hospital, the Gestapo again questioned Page, but he said nothing other than stating his name, rank and serial number. He remained in hospital undergoing treatment until January 1945 and was still on the island with other American POWs when Jersey was liberated in May of that year.
Well, it was after the war when they finally released him. Germany finally surrendered, and we found that the Page was alive. That was a great big surprise to us. We didn't think anybody was alive. We kind of hoped, but we never heard of him at all.
13 men were lost from PT509. Within a few days of the engagement, 3 of the dead were washed up on the island. Darrell Bricker on August the 11th. Richard Horsfield on the 12th. And Rudolf Schaffroth on the 15th. All 3 men were buried with military honors by the Germans at Howard Davis Park on August the 15th. 2 more bodies were recovered later, those of Marvin Lossin and William Orsley, those of Harry Christ, Charles Cornack, Kenneth Line, James Maith, John Pavlis, Tony Reynolds, Alfred Rishi, Edward Thale and Walter Wypick were never found. "56 years later, a reunion took place between a squadron shipmate and the wreck of the 509. There was no exact record of the 509's final position. As is often the case, her rediscovery happened purely by chance. Tony Titterington, a much-respected diver in Jersey waters, found her in August 1982. She was lying in 50 feet of water not far from the island's rugged southwest cliffs. Tony, an avid researcher of wrecks, had developed an instinct for the remains of sunken vessels. And as he drifted over the scattered, weed-fringed debris lying on the seabed, clue after clue began to confirm his feelings that he'd found the 509's last resting place. A more intensive search left no doubts. Pistons, a bullet-riddled piece of stainless steel, and lying on its side a few yards away from the bulk of the wreck, a 40mm gun. Looking like a small rocky outcrop to the inexperienced eye lay 3 V12 Packard engines. Final proof came in the discovery of a propeller and shaft. Engraved in the steel was the legend 509. Tony notified the US Navy that he'd found the remains of the 509, and then began retrieving and restoring artifacts from the wreck. 2 decades later, a passion for Jersey's maritime history and the thought-provoking story of the 509 led diver and wreck researcher John Ovenden towards a goal. He realized that few people were aware of the sea fight that took place beneath the very guns of Jersey's occupying forces on that fateful morning of August the 9th, 1944. He believed it was a story that should be told. John teamed up with a friend, Paul Haslam, and together they checked out the coordinates Tony had given them. He found the remains of 509 exactly where Tony Titterington said they'd be. He traced the logbooks of the USS Malloy, those of Squadron 34, and of the German convoy, and he spoke to the seamen who were there. The result produced a full and graphic account of the events that took place off the southwest coast of Jersey as the thunder of war rumbled out of France. During his research, John discovered that a strong and enduring PT boaters fraternity was alive and well in the USA. Correspondence flowed, resulting in the development of a close friendship between him and the surviving crew members of Squadron 34. Later that year, John took part of the 509 home. He met former crew members of Squadron 34 at a PT Boaters reunion in Boston. There, he presented them with a section of the boat's engine, part of the propeller shaft box, and replicas of the squadron's Walt Disney-designed Seawolf emblem, which he and Paul had made in Jersey. The artifacts now rest alongside a fully restored Elco PT boat, the 617, at the PT Boat Museum, Battleship Cove, Massachusetts. This long-distance contact was enough to bring 77-year-old ex-gunner's mate third-class Shelton Bosley 3,500 miles to a piece of ocean he would never forget. His journey took him back in time to that fateful, fog-shrouded dawn when PT Boat 509 made her last patrol, and good friends and shipmates died.
I had never set foot on the Isle of Jersey, even though we'd been there many times offshore within a mile, but never touched the shoreline. And here I was.
Within a day of arriving in Jersey for the very first time, Boz was on a headland close to where the action between his squadron and the convoy took place. The true picture began to emerge.
The other aspect was when I realized how close to the shoreline we were when this attack took place. It was less than a mile. There were reefs out in the water, and the enemy didn't get us. It's a wonder we didn't end up on one of these shoals that lay offshore.
Had the fog lifted, even momentarily, the coastal guns would have caused havoc among the PTs. Not just a single boat, but a whole squadron could have been lost. There are artifacts from the 509 looking as bright as the day she first put to sea. Thanks to the loving care of the man who recovered and restored them, they now rest at Tony Titterington's Jersey Maritime Museum. And it was here that Boz had the opportunity to meet the diver who rediscovered the lost PT.
That was about 25 yards to the west of the engine group. I picked it up because it was rather unique in the fact you've got a machine gun burst which had hit there, and there. And the exit points are here. Being stainless steel, you can see that the velocity must have been extremely high.
You know, I can relate somewhat because we were hit amidship by a large caliber shell and numerous smaller caliber shells. It would be difficult for me to identify the specific part, but it does look like a part that would come from a PT boat. And I'm also looking at the holes that you were mentioning. It's obviously that they were under heavy immense fire.
We came across a part of the torpedo that was probably the one that sank the 509. We found the stern section of it about 50 yards west of the engines. You can see the blast damage that's been done to it. How much of the explosive burnt before she detonated, you just can't tell, but the fact that she detonated on the boat would have meant that she would certainly have done a lot of structural damage to a wooden boat like that, being right on top of it. This is one of the kind of guns which was probably shooting at you at the time. It's a 8.8 centimetre C-35. This came off an armed trawler that was a little way to the east of where your action took place. Basically, they're submarine guns. They weren't a lot of use against aircraft as they only had a maximum elevation of 30 degrees. They took them off the submarines and put them onto coastal protection vessels. Now, the type of boat that was shooting at you were the inter-island vessels, and I believe it was either a 10.5 or an 8.8 which she had on board.
The following day, Boz was back at sea, reliving the courses his squadron and USS Malloy had followed during the 509's last patrol. The difference this time was that he could see where he was heading. There was no fog, and it was broad daylight. Boz wanted to dive the wreck. The chance to pay his respects to the 509 and her crew on behalf of his shipmates in the States was something he needed to do. A crash course in scuba techniques with a bunch of highly experienced divers gave him the confidence he needed. The sea was calm, the tide was slack, and Boz was ready.
Looking forward to it.
You think you're going to feel down there?
I really don't know at this point, but from what I understand from John, it's going to be pretty awesome for me.
Yeah? You're up to it, yeah?
I think so.
Good stuff.
56 years.
That's a
waiting.
long time. Long time. You've got a full tank of air there, Buzz. You've got plenty of air.
Okay.
Okay, if you want to put your mask on.
After 56 years, a very special reunion was about to take place.
Comfy?
Comfy.
Okay, there's your reg. Take a few blows. It's okay. Okay? Comfy?
Okay.
There were no flared bows, no shape or form resembling the sleek fighting boat she once was, just the bones of an old comrade in the bosom of the ocean.
Oh, it's awesome. It's more I expected.
I've always wanted to do this, to come back and dive. I've had limited diving experience, mostly in the Caribbean, and diving in this water is totally different than the channel, and I expected it to be. And to see these, the remains, the 3 Packard engines that are still in remarkably good condition after all these years, and the 40 millimeter gun. I found some other artifacts down there, but I chose not to bring them up, except this one remain here was part of the 37 millimeter shell casing. My good friend John Osley was on that gun. He was the gunner on the bow gun, and obviously he was one of the ones who was killed, and his body's never recovered. He's a good man. While I was down there, you can't reminisce too much in the channel, as you well know, down there. 40 feet, 45 feet, whatever we were. But, you know, I had to think back momentarily to some of the men who I knew, like Lieutenant Chris, who was the skipper of that boat. He was engaged to a young lady back in Pittman, New Jersey, who I never knew. But he had a favorite song, and it was called "I'm in Love with You, Honey." And he never knew quite all the words, and he had this ukulele that he brought from Honolulu from his prior tour of duty. And I could hear him sit up in the chart house sometime and playing the tune, but not knowing the words. So one night I went up and I said, "Would you like to learn the words to that song, Lieutenant?" And he said, "Yes, I would." And I said, "I'll even teach you the introduction." He said, "I didn't know it had one." And I said, "It has a pretty introduction." So I taught him the words, "I'm in love with you, honey." And so I taught him the words, but unfortunately he never got a chance to sing them, I guess, to his fiancée, obviously. I've tried to locate many, many times members of his family. I know he had a sister. I've made numerous calls to people by the name of Chris in and around the Pittman, New Jersey area, and none of them are related so far. But I'll keep trying, and that's my way on my makeup. I'll keep trying until I find somebody. I'm just thankful that I had some friends over here on the Isle of Jersey that invited me over and allowed me to do this. And I will be thankful to them forever. And I mean that in all sincerity. Best. The best.
In the case of the morning of August 9th, 1944, it should be remembered that no single action wins a war. Not all actions are of epic proportions, but each is part of the whole and earns its place in the final victory.